Hello everybody, me Mr A with chapter 5 of Susan Cooper's Oversea Under Stone. When Jane reached the grey house, Simon and Barney were chattering like monkeys in the living room to Great Uncle Merry, who sat quietly listening from the depths of a big armchair. Both boys were glowing with excitement, and even Barney's fair skin had been flushed by the wind and sun to a faint pinkish brown. "There you are, darling," Mother said. "I was just beginning to worry about you." Simon hailed her with a yell from across the room. "Oh, you should have come! It was fabulous! Like being right out at sea, and when the wind was behind us we went tremendously fast. Far better than a motorboat. Only we came back in on the engine because the wind dropped, and that was fun too. Mr. Withers came back with us for a drink, but he's gone now. Father went with him to fetch up some of the mackerel we caught." "And what's Jane been doing?" said Great Uncle Merry quietly from his corner. "Oh, nothing much," Jane said, "wandering about." But when all three children were upstairs, sent early up to bed because Father said ominously when Simon imitated a lightship siren right behind his chair, they were all overtired. Jane knocked at the door of the boys' room and went in to tell them about her discovery and her visit to the vicar. She did not get quite the enthusiastic response that she had expected. "You copied out part of the manuscript?" Simon demanded, his voice rising to a squeak of horror. "And showed it to him?" "Yes, I did," Jane said defensively. "Well, for goodness sake, what harm can that possibly do? A little penciled line in a guidebook can't mean anything to anybody. You jolly well shouldn't have done anything connected with the manuscript unless we all agreed it together." "It wasn't connected with the manuscript, not as far as he knew. I just told him I wanted to find something out about the coast." Jane forgot any uneasiness she had felt about the vicar in building a defence against Simon's indignation. "I thought you'd be grateful. My finding out the manuscript map shows Kamari Head." "She's quite right, you know," Barney said from his pillow. "It's terrifically important finding that out. For all we knew up to now, it might have been a map of Timbuktu. And if it turns out what the vicar says, that Trevisick hasn't changed since our map was drawn, that's going to help us when we find if there are any clues in the manuscript." "Oh, I dare say," Simon said grudgingly, clambering into bed and kicking off all the blankets. "Oh, well, yes, it does help. We'll talk about it tomorrow." "Then we can start our quest," Barney said sleepily. "Night, Jane. See you in the morning." "Good night." But the morning brought more than any of them had bargained for. Simon woke first very early. The air was still as warm as it had been the day before. He lay in his pyjamas, staring up at the ceiling for a little while, listening to Barney's peaceful breathing from the other bed. Then he grew restless, so he went out and padded downstairs barefoot, feeling hungry. If he found Mrs. Polk already in the kitchen, he might manage to have 2 breakfasts. But Mrs. Polk seemed not to have arrived yet, and the house was quite silent. It was not until he reached the flight of stairs leading down into the hall that Simon first noticed something wrong. Always, on his way down to breakfast, he stopped to look at the old map of Cornwall that hung on the wall at the turn of the stairs, but when he looked for it this morning, it was not there. Only a rectangular mark on the wallpaper showed where it had hung, and as Simon glanced along the wall of pictures down the stairs, he saw there were several more gaps as well. Puzzled, he went slowly down into the hall. He found several strange, naked-looking patches where pictures had been taken down, and the barometer next to one empty space was leaning sideways. Simon went across and straightened it, feeling the bare wooden blocks of the floor cool under his bare feet. Looking down the long hall, he could see nothing else unusual at first. Then he noticed that at the far end, where the sun was streaming in from the kitchen through the open doorway, several of the blocks had been wrenched out and were strewn all over the floor. Simon stared, puzzled. He stared down the hall towards the kitchen, and then, on an impulse, turned to his right and reached for the handle of the door into the living room. It squeaked under his touch as it always did, and nervously Simon opened the door and peered round. Then he gasped. The room looked as though a tornado had blown through it in the night. The pictures hung crooked on the walls or lay torn from their frames on the floor, and the furniture seemed to Simon's first startled glance to be completely buried in books. Everywhere there were books, scattered over the floor, open, closed, upside down, heaped on the tables and chairs, mounded on the sideboard, and a lonely few still lying on the empty shelves. All the locked bookcases around the walls that they had been forbidden to touch were empty. The glass doors hung loose from their hinges, with splintered wood showing round their locks, and one or two, completely wrenched away, were propped against the wall. The shelves had been swept clear of everything they held, and the drawers below were open, with papers spilling from them loose onto the chaos of books on the floor. There was a faint, musty smell, and a thin pall of dust seemed to hang in the air. For one frozen moment, Simon stood staring, aghast. Then he turned on his heel and raced upstairs, shouting for his father. Everyone was woken out their early half-sleep by his shouts. Led by father, they all stumbled out into the passage in pyjamas and nightdresses and followed Simon downstairs, trying dazedly to understand the words tumbling over each other out of his mouth. "What is it? What's the matter? Is the house on fire?" "Burglars," father said incredulously, following down the stairs. "But you don't get burgled in a village like... Good heavens!" He caught sight of the devastation in the living room through the open door. As Mother, Jane and Barney followed his gaze, they fell silent too, but not for long. Wherever they went on the ground floor of the house, they found the same thing. The doors of bookcases had been ripped off, and the books tumbled off the shelves into a chaotic jumble on the floor. Every locked drawer or cupboard had been forced, and the papers from inside scattered wildly about. Even in the breakfast room, half a dozen elderly cookery books had been scattered from a shelf. "I don't understand this," father said slowly. "The place is practically wrecked, but one or two obvious things that are clearly valuable haven't been touched. That statuette on the mantelpiece there, for instance, and that big silver cup on the sideboard in the front room. There doesn't seem any point to any of it." "Someone was rejoicing in destruction," Barney said solemnly. Simon said slowly, "They must have made an awful noise. Why didn't it wake us up?" "We're 2 floors away," Barney said. "You can't hear anything up there." "I like this, it's mysterious." "I don't," Jane shivered. "Imagine someone wandering about down here all night while we were asleep upstairs. It gives me the creeps." "Perhaps there wasn't anyone," Barney said. "Don't be an idiot, of course there was. Or do you think all the books jumped off the shelves?" "Well, it needn't have been human. It might have been one of those special sorts of ghosts that throws things about just for fun. A poltergeist," said father. "He was opening all the silver cupboards to see if anything had gone." "There you are, one of those." "Well, Mrs. Polk says the house is supposed to be haunted," Jane said. "Oh dear." They all looked at one another, round-eyed, and suddenly shivered. Mother said, appearing suddenly in the doorway and making them all jump, "Well, it's the first ghost I've ever heard of who wear crepe-soled shoes. Dick, come here and have a look out here." Father straightened up and followed her out onto the kitchen. With the children close at his heels, Mother pointed without a word. 2 kitchen windows were open, the big one over the sink and a small one above it, and so was the door. And on the flat white tiles of the tabletop beside the sink there was the faint but unmistakable outline of a footprint, a large footprint with bar markings across the sole, and traces of the same markings on the windowsill above. "Gosh." "There's your ghost," father said cheerfully, although he did not look cheerful at all. Then he turned on them briskly. "Now come on, all of you, off upstairs and get dressed. You've seen all there is to see." He waved his hands as all 3 children began to protest vigorously. "This isn't a game, it's extremely serious. We shall have to call the police, and I don't want anything touched before they arrive. Off!" Father had one voice which stopped all argument, and this was it. Simon, Jane and Barney trailed reluctantly out of the kitchen door and along the hall, and then stopped still at the foot of the stairs, looking up. Great Uncle Merry was heavily descending the stairs towards them, clad in a pair of brilliant red pyjamas and with his white hair all standing up on end. He was yawning prodigiously and rubbing his eyes in a puzzled kind of way. "Won't do," he was muttering to himself. "Can't make it out. Heavy sleep. Most unusual." Then he caught sight of the children. "Good morning," he said with dignity, as if he were fully and impeccably dressed. "Befuddled though I am this morning, a great clamour has been penetrating up the stairs from down here. Is anything wrong?" "We've had burglars," Simon began, but Father came striding out after them from the kitchen and clapped his hands. Come on, come on! I told you to go and get dressed." "Oh good, there you are, Mary. The most extraordinary thing has happened." He glared at the children and they hastily ran upstairs. After breakfast, the police arrived from St Austell, a solid, red-faced sergeant and a very young constable following him like a mute shadow. Simon was looking forward to eager questions about his discovery of the crime. At the very least, he thought vaguely, he would have to make a statement. He was not quite sure what this meant, but it sounded familiar and important. But the sergeant only said to him, his warm Cornish accent stroking the words, "Came down first, did he?" "Yes, that's right." "Touch anything?" "No, not a thing. Well, I did straighten the barometer. It was crooked." Looking round at the chaos, Simon thought how silly this sounded. "Ah, hear anything?" "No." "All quite as usual, eh? Apart from the mess?" Yes, it was really." "Ah," said the sergeant. He grinned at Simon sitting eagerly on the edge of his chair. "All right, I'll let you off this time." "Oh," said Simon, deflated. "Is that all?" "I reckon so," the sergeant said placidly, tugging his jacket down over his stout middle. "Now, sir," he said to Father, "if we might take a look at this footprint you say you found." Yes, of course. Father led them out to the kitchen. The children, drifting behind, peeped through the door. The sergeant gazed impassively at the footprint for some moments, said to his speechless constable, "Now take good note of that, young George," and moved ponderously out to the disorder of the living room. "You say there seems to be nothing gone, sir?" "Well, it's difficult to tell, of course, since it's a rented house," Father said, "but certainly nothing valuable seems to be missing. The silver's all intact, not that there's much of it anyway. That cup, as you see, wasn't touched. But they seem to go for the books, and I can't vouch for those. There may well be some missing that we don't know about." "'Tis a proper mess, surely." The sergeant bent down with some effort and picked up a book. A small, deflated black cobweb lay across one of its pages. "Very old, these. Valuable, maybe. Quite well off the captain is, I believe." "If I might suggest, Sergeant," Great-uncle Merry said diffidently from the edge of the group. "What is it, Professor?" The sergeant beamed at him all over his rosy countryman's face. Even he seemed to know Great-uncle Merry inexplicably well. "I've had no chance to look very thoroughly, since most of the bookcases were locked. But I should have said that very few of the books in this house are valuable, to a dealer at any rate. None of them was worth more than a few pounds at the outside. Funny, they seem to have been looking for something. Hey, look here." The sergeant shifted aside some of the papers whitening the floor, and they saw a pile of empty picture frames. "Those are from the hall," Simon said at once. "That bumpy gold frame had a map in it from the top of the stairs." No map in it now. All of them been ripped out. Still, I dare say we'd find something in all this clutter." The sergeant rocked to and fro on his heels, gazing with an expression of mild regret at the battered bookcases and piles of books. He rubbed one of his shiny silver buttons thoughtfully and finally turned to Father with an air of decision. "Sheer hooliganism, I reckon, sir. Can't be no other explanation. Seldom is round these parts, anyway." "Ah," said the young constable regretfully, then immediately turned crimson and looked down at his feet. The sergeant beamed at him. "Someone with a grudge against the captain, I dare say, having a go at his belongings. Might well be one or two people hereabouts who don't like him. He's a funny old bird. Wouldn't he say so, Professor?" "You might call him that," Great-uncle Merry said abstractly. He was standing looking about him with a puzzled frown. "Breaking in isn't difficult in a place the size of Truissic," the sergeant said. "People don't expect it. They leave their windows open. Did he lock up last night, Dr. Drew?" "Yes, I always do, back to front." Father scratched his head. "I could swear there weren't any windows open downstairs, but I must admit I didn't go round trying them all." All right, thanks very much. See you tomorrow for part 2 of chapter 5. Bye-bye.